will introduce at this time our esteemed panelist, Mr. Chris Burkhardt from Cincinnati Public Schools. Jesse, if you could advance to the next slide, and I'll let Chris introduce himself first, and then I'll introduce myself and get into the presentation.
Thanks, Carl. Thank you for having me. I'm Christopher Burkhardt. I'm the Chief Operating Officer for Cincinnati Public Schools, Cincinnati, Ohio, 36,000 student district. And we've just undergone some really significant changes to our transportation, and I'm happy to share those with you today.
And I am Carl Allen. I'm the founder and CEO of Formative. I previously was Director of Transportation for Boston Public Schools, but came into that work as an engineer and an urban planner. I had been a teacher, was a Peace Corps volunteer, but really entered in as an outsider with a different sort of perspective into student mobility, and including one in public transportation and just, again, broader sort of city issues. And so that's part of the origin of our Formative's approach, which is one where we serve as a manager, a multimodal manager for lots of different schools around the country, and then also do consultative work, as we will talk about here with Cincinnati Public Schools. And so excited to launch in. All right, so I'll let Chris, we're going to talk about 22-23 school year, which seems like ages ago. We're starting the 24-25 school year, but so this is kind of a case study that we're going to be going through to talk about, tell a story of what happened in Cincinnati, how Formative partnered with the district to implement some significant changes. And at the end, we'll talk about kind of where things are at right now. But I'll let Chris start with the background of where things were at in Cincinnati.
Yeah, thanks, Carl. So I want to paint a picture for you is that Cincinnati Public Schools transportation for, I'm going to call it decades, has been tumultuous. At the start of school every year, we have all the major news stations out in front of our building, our administrative building, and they all want to know, and they're all doing stand-ups about transportation, and that's their bread and butter at the beginning of the school year. And then at each one of our board meetings, we have stand-ups in front of our school board meetings talking about transportation. So we've had a tumultuous situation here for many years, but back in 2022-23, I think we hit a crescendo. We added our 7th and 8th graders from our Metro Transit system back onto our yellow bus system. And we had about 3,000 students at the beginning of the school year that did not have yellow bus service. We did not have enough drivers. We did not have enough buses. And then additionally, we had about 36 drivers calling off every day. So not only did we not have enough buses and drivers for the approximately 3,000 students, we also had the daily shortages. So our on-time percentage was really, really low. We were in the 40 or 50% range. We were actually getting students to school an hour late because we were double up and tripling up some routes. And so that was the only way that we were able to get through from day to day. And so all of our optimization efforts that we tried to put into place previously all failed. And so as a result, we had really low trust from families. We had low trust from the community. And so we knew we needed to do something. So what was it that we wanted to do? Obviously, stabilize the system. We wanted to make sure that we could put money where our mouth is and not overextend ourselves. But at the end of the day, get every student to and from school on a timely basis. And I know that's a pretty low bar, but coming from where we were at, that was what we needed to do. We wanted to make sure that whatever changes that we made were not those silver bullets that were a flash in the pan, if you will. We wanted to make sure that they were holistic and they were going to be able to not only solve some of the problems for the next school year, but also go into building upon those incremental wins and building a sustainable program that's going to last for the next couple of decades. We had a lot of discussions back and forth on risk versus reward, on a lot of the levers that we had to press, and trying to get the community and schools involved in those decisions. And we'll talk a lot about that coming up. But we needed to make a holistic change to how we operated our bus system and how we could get students to school on time. I like to say that we started with a dumpster fire, and we ended up a year later, really doing well. So I'll let Carl talk a little bit more about this as well.
Yeah, so when we were brought in, there were a few different asks that we were asked to address. So one was help immediately stabilizing the system. So how could we, were there quick wins? Were there quick interventions that we could recommend to help provide coverage, improve on-time performance, improve service? But then also looking towards the longer term at the same time, there was a desire to electrify the bus fleet over the long term, and just in general think about holistic sustainability. And the way we think about holistic sustainability is not just the environmental dimension, which includes electrification, but also, in our view, just includes in general how you can reduce VMT, or the number of miles that you need to travel, the number of vehicle miles per student that is being traveled. So better to eliminate a bus altogether than to electrify it, in our view. So that's part of environmental sustainability. Also, just operational sustainability. Can the district sustain and manage the complexity of the system before them, and their vendor mix and modal mix? And then, of course, financial sustainability. How can we make it more affordable? And then, part of this too, this last piece, garnering investment and change, was, as Chris mentioned, just getting broad stakeholder support in the changes that we were going to implement. And so we were a partner in that, helping, working shoulder to shoulder with Chris and the administration and their board and their families, and that the project would not just be, a set of recommendations or some new design or magic bullet that would be implemented, but rather a long negotiation with a whole set of trade-offs and ongoing engagement with stakeholders to get to a place where we, again, understood the risks and rewards, and were making the right trade-offs as things were being implemented, things that were practically possible and didn't expend too much political or community capital all at once. So how could we sort of do it in a phased way and show success as we went along? So next slide, please. The formatives approach, how we started with this quick assessment of opportunities. Where are the big levers? What could we do again in the near term to stabilize service? And what was the potential bang for your buck, the cost to implement or the challenge to implement versus the benefits to be derived. So that's the first phase, just a scan of everything, and where did we see those big opportunities. The next was, understanding where the opportunities were, understanding the kind of political environment and other contextual factors. We would go deeper and analyze sets of scenarios, so that we could then know, okay, if we went through with this set of interventions, what would be simulating in more detail, what would be the result, or what could be the potential benefit, and again, trade-offs and risks. And then finally, this long-term pathway to sustainability. So that included, if we identified opportunities that were harder to implement in the near term, what could be implemented in the long term over a 3 to 5 year plan, in conjunction with a roadmap to electrification. So looking at a whole set of potential interventions over the long term, over a multi-year time frame. And then, throughout this whole process, we would be supporting, as I'd mentioned, strategic engagement with the board, with the administration, with the transportation department internally, who needed to buy in to this and own this and had key knowledge, key agency, a really, really critical role to play. school leaders who, when you're talking about schedules and what service should look like, how it will impact their families, are tremendously invested and interested. And then, of course, families who are impacted when you talk about stops and time changes. And, so we know how critical these decisions are and how it impacts families' choices, and their whole school experience, something as seemingly simple as a school bell time. I know that personally, with my 3 children and how it's affected the choice of the schools that we send them to. Next slide, please. So again, just to talk about what we found in our opportunity analysis, as we look across with a really broad brush, what are the big system levers that we could pull to affect change? And bell times really stuck out. And the district was aware of this and understood that they had some misalignment and that there might be an opportunity to, move to either a more aligned 2-tier system or even a 3-tier system. And again, just with our initial scan, we found that, in fact, yes, this was the biggest singular thing that could reduce the need for vehicles and drivers and get the district to, a place of sustainability, but yet not something that you could do willy-nilly, not something, that you could do quickly. We also noted a lot of the vehicles were underutilized. That had to do with a lot of suboptimal pairings that had to be made and how routes had to be shortened because of the bell times, but also stop distances and other factors, route lengths. Some routes, I mentioned some were short so that they could pair. Others had to be long so they couldn't pair, right? Just because of the nature of school choice and non-CPS schools that the district had to transport. And so, in fact, this was one of the core challenges that the district dealt with, was this high degree of choice, a high degree of geographical sprawl, and then also, relatively accommodating bus stops, meaning that they had a high percentage of their routes that were challenged to pair, that couldn't run in less than, many of them couldn't run in less than an hour. The service levels, as I mentioned, very accommodating by and large. So most families across grades and across programs getting, very accommodating stops, and that being a key lever for streamlining, shortening routes so that you could have better pairings. And then that there was opportunities to mode shift. So we found that even within the confines of the district's policies, there were opportunities for more students to walk. And when we also did a very granular analysis, student by student, of transit journeys, we found that there were a lot more students that could use public transit than who were currently assigned to public transit, and that those students may not need a bus assignment. Finally, there were low density routes that would fill up with time before they could fill up with students, again, just by their nature, the geography they had to cover. And so many of those routes could be shifted to smaller vehicles that didn't require CDL drivers. And also that, there were empty seats and stops where we believed that there were families that didn't need the bus and just maybe hadn't expressed it, or might be willing to opt out, maybe used it intermittently. And so this was a part of, some of the sets of opportunities that we identified. And I think this is one, a way I wanted to cast, how we take a broad brush and think about these things very holistically. What are all the different levels you have to pull? And what we're focusing on today is this bell time question, not because, again, it's not an easy thing, nor a short-term thing, but because it was, the most impactful thing that we decided to tackle, and on a longer term time frame. Next slide, please. All right. So digging into the bell time question, and I'm going to turn most of the conversation over to Chris as I do the next 2 slides. But we got into the scenario analysis of, okay, bell times, there's big opportunity here, but there's different ways to do it. So going to a 2-tier system has its benefits, less radical change, but also less potential improvements, only or reductions, only let's say 2 trips max in the morning for a vehicle versus 3 in a 3-tier system. And so we looked at both and talked about the trade-offs and risks of both, and that's what you're looking at here. For 2 tiers, again, you can spread them out further. You can provide more slack to run the routes longer, fill up the seats, more easily pair the routes. It's easier for drivers, less pressure. There's less pressure to adjust day lengths. So in your PM, even if your AM is well aligned, the PM is messier because of different day lengths that schools have, and so you can accommodate that. There's fewer choices for schools if they liked having their particular bell times and maybe wanted to have a menu of choices. It was going to affect more schools if we were to change to a 2-tier system. And also we had these non-CPS schools that we needed to persuade. With 3 tiers, there's more options. It was a smaller magnitude of change for most schools and therefore most families. But if you could do it, it would, reduce the number of buses and drivers required the greatest, but it would require more shortening of routes. And so probably more dramatic interventions around things like stop consolidation. The route pairing becomes more complex. Your tier 3 schools, as many of you have probably experienced, have the hardest time being on time because issues trickle down to the 3rd tier. And nobody wanted to be a 9 o'clock school. Nobody wants to finish at 4. And so those were less desirable times and less amenable for schools. So the thing is that there isn't a correct answer. It's so contextual. There's trade-offs and risks to each approach. And so much of it has to do with this negotiation with your community and with your schools, what you can change now, what you can change in the long term, how it aligns with other district goals like healthy start times and so on. So all this contextual information is so critical to make a decision. We can go to the next slide. I think this is just a sense of this is where we were at the top. This was kind of the state of number of trips at each time with the different bell times and arrival times. And you can see the scenario where we landed, where we ended up landing after a lot of negotiation and analysis of different options was kind of a hybrid tier 2 model. So sort of 2 sets of 2 tiers where we could have more pairing options, provide more options for schools, but still create better alignment. And so again, through the course of negotiation, we came up with something that wasn't a clean 2 or a 3, but was something hybrid, almost a 4 tier, but not quite. And it was very pragmatic and not, didn't get to the full potential ideal state of bus savings, but it was something that we could do. And so now I think, how we got here is really where the story goes now. And that's what Chris is going to launch into.
Yeah, so thanks, Carl. Yeah, we had a heck of a ride, no pun intended. We, as Carl said, we had a myriad of start times. So we had 9 different start times to start to juggle and figure out what that would look like in a new system. And the other piece that I'm remiss that I didn't say earlier is we have schools of choice. So we have a lot of students who are traversing the district to pick a school wherever in the district they wanted to go. So those were 2 additional challenges that actually influenced some of our decisions on why we went with a 2-tiered system versus a 3-tiered system. So we started with transportation roundtables sessions throughout the community, and we held 7 sessions in total. We varied the time, the location, in person and virtual, and we wanted to keep it open-ended. So we didn't go to the roundtable saying, here's your choices, 2-tier, 3-tier, how do we solve this problem? We really said, let's imagine transportation. What could good transportation in Cincinnati look like? And how do we get there? So we valued both opinions and solutions, regardless of whether we were going to implement them or not. And we also knew that there were going to be multiple solutions to solve this problem. It wasn't just a tiered start time. It was how do we look at how folks are far they're walking to their stop. In Cincinnati, we went from almost a pickup at your front door and deliver you to school. And so we knew that that wasn't optimum either. We know we needed to not only change start times, but look at how many students were on the bus and how many times we were actually stopping that bus to pick up students. And that wasn't a very easy task to ask the community, because um, if you're a parent, you want your student to be picked up right outside your door. And so to ask them to walk a block or 2 blocks or even 3 blocks down the street was a really tough discussion. But at the end of the day, there were trade-offs. So do we want a stable system? And if so, could you give up, walking a block or 2 blocks to get that stable system? So a lot of dialogue, held sessions in the morning, afternoon, again, both virtual as well as in person, and then a couple out in the community. So we tried to get as many voices heard as possible. Next slide, please. So we really put the topics of conversations into a bunch of buckets. And so as we looked at the first and probably the most important bucket is start times. And as I said earlier, we had 9 different start times to deal with. And knowing also that we not only transport students in Cincinnati public schools, but we also support our charters and non-publics as well. And we knew that we could not change their start times, but we could only change our own. And so we started looking at what could those start times look like as we tried to navigate not changing start times drastically. For example, if you were at a 7:30, would 7:40 be an example versus an 8:30? And trying to keep those times as uniform as we can, but also with as little change as we could. We then looked at mileage and the time on the bus. And so the question that we asked, what is reasonable? And we asked that throughout the entire process, but really within this tiered of questions, what's reasonable of an amount of time on a bus and what's acceptable. Now, we do also have a board policy that says no one should be riding a bus more than 55 minutes. And so that was something that we've always tried to strive for. But in some cases, parents were saying, well, I don't want my child on the bus for more than 20 minutes. And that just created additional dialogue and additional asks that we had to consider and had to really decide on the trade-offs. Do we want a longer bus route to be and have it be more efficient, or a shorter route that is not as efficient, but limits the amount of time? And we've also talked about quadrants of the city, and could we put into place different parameters within quadrants, and how could we honor schools of choice? Meaning, were we going to say that if you were in the, let's call it the East Corridor, we would transport you anywhere in the East Corridor you want? Or if you were in quadrant 1, we would transport you to any of the touching quadrants, but we weren't going to transport you, to one that was across the city. And so we had a whole bunch of different examples set up. But really, again, I want to stress that this was really open-ended. So we had a few prompts just to keep the conversations on track. But really, it was a situation in which we said, how do you want this built? And how do we do that for you? And we've really got a myriad of answers, but there are some common themes, and some of those we'll talk about in a few minutes. Next slide, please. The two last topics is seventh and eighth graders on yellow bus. So as I started the conversation, our seventh and eighth graders were on Metro. They came back to yellow bus, which exacerbated our situation and gave us a lot harder task to get kids to school. And so we wanted to think about how could we reduce the number of students on the bus, i.e., could we look at alternative transportation for seventh and eighth graders? We also looked at pay in lieu of, which is something that we actually tried to do within that year. And we offered a prorated amount if students would either get themselves to school, and or we also offered a Metro pass to those students who wanted a Metro pass. And then that dovetails into both hub and spoke and yellow bus and Metro hybrid. You know, we were also looking at not just one option across our portfolio. And as Carl stated, when we talk about mobility, we're really talking about all the different ways for students to get to school. So imagine a student walking to a bus stop and being picked up by possibly Metro and being dropped off at a location and then being picked up by a yellow bus and that yellow bus being taken to school. Or maybe it's a van that picks them up and delivers them to one school, and then the yellow bus takes them to their final destination. So we really wanted to exhaust all of our options, and we really wanted to unpack what would a non-conventional system look like, i.e., I think everyone's used to standing out front of their house, being picked up by a yellow bus, that yellow bus picking up additional students and heading right to the final destination. And so we wanted to unpack, what if that didn't happen? What are our alternatives to that? And how could we create something that was sustainable based on thinking outside the box? Next slide, please. One final was the bus stop locations. And so I mentioned this earlier. The bus stop locations were really tricky to navigate because we knew from a transportation side that having less stops and having students walking further, i.e., half up to a half mile to a stop, was, you know, the most beneficial options. But we also knew that we couldn't go from pick up in front of the house to walking a half a mile in one fell swoop. So we really had to come up with what we thought a reasonable amount was. And so I think we kind of settled on a quarter of a mile as being the reasonable amount going into it, knowing that in year two, we'd start to stretch that a little bit. In year three, we'd start to stretch a little bit more. But going from a situation where students are picked up almost in front of their house to any kind of walking zone was really different. And so those conversations really had to be the hard conversations you have with parents and the community to say, we can't operate like we have, and something's got to give. So is this one of those things that could give? So next slide, please. So board, oh, I think we go back one. There we go. Thank you. So we actually had board presentations also at each one of the board meetings in March, April, May, and June. And we started with how we got there, or how we got to where we are, and how we were going to get to where we wanted to go. And that was very important for us to talk through how we got to where we are, as students were waiting an hour for a bus and showing up to school an hour late. And so as we looked at kind of, you know, peeling back, you know, the looking in the mirror, where are we? And I don't think you can accept where you want to go until you fully accept where you are. we looked through a whole bunch of solutions. Obviously, we took all the feedback from the focus groups. We took a lot of data from formative, and at each step along the way, we took all of that data, and meaning data from the focus groups, data from formative, our best thinking of what we could do based on those two things. And at each step along the way, we asked our board to vote on what they had an appetite for, and so we would literally every month bring a new scenario up and say, what does this look like from your lens? And so that also gave us the ability to have that debate and those conversations in the public as well. So as families were weighing in, they could also hear their voice being heard by the board as that was discussed. I think that's very, very important through the whole process, that we tried to be as transparent as possible and tried to get as much buy-in and feedback from both students, parents, community members, and the greater Cincinnati community at every step along the way. Next slide, please. So, at the time we had 36 more routes than drivers. And then we had additional 33 folks basically calling off every day. And that, that's by just pure operational issues with folks calling in sick or folks leaving the job or whatever. So as we looked at the routes and the drivers, we knew the shortages that we had. And one of the things, as Carl talked about earlier, was the struggle is, do we go with a two-tier system or do we go with a three-tier system? If you look back at the numbers that Carl shared earlier, the two-tiered system was saving us roughly about 33 to 35 bus drivers, which coincidentally was the exact amount of routes more than drivers that we currently had. So we really looked at it not to be a silver bullet to say, hey, let's overextend ourselves and let's see how much we can possibly save. Again, as I started with the conversation, we just wanted to get level set. We just wanted to get a solution that got kids to school every single day without trying to find that magic bullet. And so we ended up going to the two-tiered system, which is a little bit of a hybrid, but that gave us the ability just to level set in what we needed versus what the data was telling us. Next slide, please. So I think both Carl and I will talk a little bit about this, but the first part of what we were looking at with start times was reducing and balancing the number of start times in the district. As I said earlier, we had 9 different start times, and that was just CPS. That wasn't including the charters and non-publics. I will say that those charter and non-public conversations that we had many calls with them as well. And the conversations focused around, we know we can't make you change, but if you want reliable service every single day, this is what time we can get your students to your school. And it was not there to be threatening at all. And it wasn't um, a situation in which we were trying to bully them into a start time that they didn't feel comfortable with, but it was also realizing the issue at hand, and that was, we don't have excess buses, we don't have excess drivers. This is what time that we can logically get your students to the campus. And in most cases, those schools said, yeah, we can probably flex our time by 5 or 10 minutes to align to one of the tiers. And really that was instrumental in getting to where we needed to go. Carl, you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I'll add that, this part of the pragmatic approach when you're talking about bell times is you can have the conversation at the level of bell times, which is, obviously super consequential for staff and families, but also start to get, creative with drop-off times and pickup times and understanding tolerance at different campuses for, accepting students a little bit earlier. And that's what Chris was kind of alluding to. That's the kind of thing that you can do in the near term, right? So I think we did a little bit of that, just identifying, hey, if we had a 5 minute earlier drop off or a 10 minute earlier drop off at this school, if they're not, even if they're not willing to change the start of instruction because of the teacher contract or whatever, can they stipend a staff to be there a few minutes early? And this is a lot of what, I did when I was in Boston Public Schools with our charter schools that wanted to set their own bell times, but we just, we said, we'll support a stipend for this partner. We had City Year, which is a great program in the city of Boston and around the country. City Year volunteers will be there, to do enrichment and supervise breakfast, if we drop off 10 minutes earlier. And then that allowed us to put a whole other trip on that bus and save an entire vehicle, right? So those kinds of things, if you can save a bus driver and a whole vehicle, it was worth stipending, a city year volunteer for an extra, 15 minutes of work every morning. So it's those kinds of creative solutions. And then what this talks about here is you just sort of the phased approach and how we kind of led the board down the road of considering these options one by one, each of the biggest opportunities we'd identified, but knowing that start times are one of these core foundational elements that just set, besides the geography that you have to cover, the students you're required to transport, and the times they need to get where they're going. Those are the three things, more than anything else, that just tell you what you have to do and then how efficient you can be, within that framework is what follows, right? So it's core, it's foundational. And so that's why you start there.
And I'm remiss not saying this earlier, but the slides that you're actually looking at are the slides that we actually shared with the Board of Education and in our roundtables. So as we went through this process, the slides that you're seeing, this exact slide is one that we shared with the board to talk through, what this looks like. So not only are you seeing the results, you are actually seeing the process as we were going through it. I think next slide. So this can get awful complicated here, but we went with a two-tier model, and really what we were trying to do is you can see a CPS and an NPC, and NPC is non-public and charter. So you would see that in scenario A that there were 12 CPS schools and 16 non-public and charters that would have to move less than 15 minutes. And so as you looked across the 15 to 30 and the greater than 30 minutes, is you can look in option A and see, or scenario A, I should say, and see that, we'd have 45 schools that needed a greater than 30-minute change in time. And so as we looked at those types of scenarios, we were able to X off some of the options because they weren't going to be realistic to ask 45 schools to change their time by more than 30 minutes. And as you can see, scenario B, we still had a couple. So we still had 6 CPS schools and 7 NPC schools that needed to change their time. But overall, it was the best option. So we specifically had a 7:40 paired with an 8:50 school start time, which gave us 70 minutes for route beginning to end, meaning leaving bus lots, picking up first set of students, going to one school, then starting second route and running that route and being done and having those students actually delivered to their school as well. So we were very intentional to have that 70 minutes, 7:40 paired with an 8:50 and 8 o'clock paired with 9:10. Carl, anything to add here?
You can see, I think, just the most I would point everyone to is, like Chris said, that that the number of schools and how they were impacted was the singularly most important factor, right, in terms of what strategy we were gonna pursue. I mean, of course, it needed to create the reductions too, but just what were we actually going to be able to negotiate and get schools and families to accept? And so that 15-minute threshold was really, is a perceptual one, but it was real. That when you asked, for a 16 or 20-minute change that felt like a big deal, a 15-minute change didn't feel like a big deal for staff and families.
Next slide. And again, these are slides that we shared with our Board of Education. And so you can see the 15 to 30-minute change in start times, as well as the greater than 30 minutes, which schools were affected by those. And again, we were trying to lessen the number of schools that had a change that was great. So as we really had those conversations with each one of those campuses as we got deeper and deeper in the weeds. So when we got to this point, we were having conversations with each campus, campus administration. We would show up at a PTO meeting or have a roundtable at that school to really have those conversations about what that was going to look like for the next year, and make sure that we heard everyone along the way. As Carl said, sometimes that would mean having some providers come in earlier to accept the students off the bus, and sometimes that meant folks could sleep in a little bit more. So we really tried to be as open and transparent through the process as possible. So as we looked at the distance in the stop distance, I should say, by program, we were looking at public and charter, non-public, magnet, open enrollment. As we looked at all of the students and the walk to stop distance and home to school distance, we were really underutilizing, and this was one of those areas that I think that in hindsight we probably could have been a little bit more aggressive in our walk to stop distance, because we were at 0.17 or 0.15, and we really wanted to be closer to the 0.25 on that. And that's, I think, something that we learned a little bit after the fact, is we really needed to be doing a lot of that work while we were building it, because we got to the end and we were remiss that we didn't have enough time to really optimize the routes, and by changing the stops before the school year started. So we did a great job with taking the data that we had while we were working with it. But had we had another, I would call it, week or 2 weeks, we could have been optimized even better, and that walk to stop distance could have been a little bit greater. So Carl, I'll let you start off here with some of the successes here.
Yeah, I think so. Obviously, we focused on bell times, and that was the hardest and the most involved piece with respect to board engagement, right? And those were the slides that Chris shared. The other piece that we were able to pursue in tandem was this last bit about stop consolidation, and that, there were already established practices and policies around how far the district was willing to transport or have students walk to bus stops, right? What we found was that the practice was far more accommodating than that. So it wasn't like we needed a board vote or we needed much explanation to the board or cajoling to get them to agree that we ought to consolidate stops. But it was a conversation with families, right, about, because it was going to impact a lot of families, and we wanted to be strategic and differentiate who was going to be impacted and be sensitive to neighborhood concerns. But then also there was this whole piece of buy-in with the team, the transportation team, who they're the ones that are doing the routing. They're the ones that know these neighborhoods the best, who've created the system as it stood. And so I think, I'll speak to that piece where it was critical that our approach honored their knowledge, gave them agency, and empowered them to do the implementing in a smart way, and didn't feel like it was some, external agency foisting some, new set of routes on them. So that's, we worked very closely with their routing team and did an executed approach where we deleted a bunch of stops. Our whole optimization was based on their existing stop network. So we didn't invent any new stops. We deleted a bunch of stops that we thought could be deleted, and then students reassigned within the bounds of what we thought was an acceptable walk to stop, and then worked with the team to establish a process where they would review the routes and add stops back where they knew there were safety hazards, or reasons why specific neighborhoods, specific students couldn't or shouldn't walk that far to a bus stop. So there was a little bit of a deep cut and then a little bit of a dial back, but everyone was aligned on the goal to reduce the number of stops, and they were empowered to make those choices to add stops back. But in the process, we were also codifying barriers and information about safety hazards and places where students shouldn't cross, and building that into their system, and or auditing perhaps barriers that they'd had in there that maybe needed to be reevaluated, right? That we didn't used to be safe on a certain street, for example, but now there was a new crosswalk there, and so it should be okay for a kid to cross this street. So that process was then beneficial, and they bought into it, and I think that was critical for them having success in doing the exercise, and then also owning the results and having Chris and the superintendent back them up when families, ultimately many families, were not happy about having to walk further, but we had this established criteria. We understood the benefits, and we were able to hold the line, right, for the most part. And then they were able to preempt the issues that they knew they were going to have to dial back anyways, and so that helped.
Next slide. So after all the work, after everything that we've done, we were successful. I will say that the cameras were still outside the board office on the first day of school, but I will tell you that they were positive stories. That by day 2 and day 3, there wasn't much to report from a news standpoint, other than we had gotten it pretty much right, and that we were getting kids to school on time. The results, obviously, you can see the savings of around $3 million. We reduced by about 100 routes. On day 1 of school, we had full coverage, which is not something that we were saying, 12 months prior. And so looking at adding vans to the fleet, and then the long-term sustainability plan, you can actually see our superintendent with her camera up, and with students smiling on the first day of school, which was a very different situation than just 12 months prior. So it all worked out. We still are using the data and optimizing it on a daily basis, but obviously this is year 2, and we opened schools 2 weeks ago. And again, we opened with very little complaints about transportation. So the thing that I am holding my hat with is that we did this in year 1, but we were able to replicate it in year 2, and that's what really matters. You can almost do anything once, but making sure that you can replicate it is really the important part of the work. Anything to add, Carl?
No, I mean, I think it's we're pleased, obviously, with the results that you had, and also to hear that that the progress continues, right? And I think that's great. I know you've had some challenges. You still have some of the challenges that many of you have of specific vendors kind of come up short on what they're committed to provide. And but this, having these kinds of strategies in place and this kind of annual sort of set of practices around stop consolidation, looking at bell times, looking at trip pairings, and building a culture of continuous improvement helps you to weather that storm. And then also building a culture around multimodality and use of public transit, other walkability, and working long-term in partnership with your cities around infrastructure. This is the long-term strategic stuff that helps you weather the crises when they inevitably, occur, and hopefully you avoid some of them. But transportation is really tough, and so you're putting out fires, but you've got to do this strategic foundation laying too. So I think you've done that with your team there, Chris, and yeah, we're happy to be a part of it. So I know we're almost out of time, and Jesse's been answering some questions in the chat, but happy to take others now. And we'll post the recording online and hope that folks check out our Student Mobility Hub as well. Feel free to shoot in any other questions that you have. And thank you again for joining us on what I'm sure is a busy day for all of you. Okay, yeah, with that, I think we can wrap it up. And thanks all. Thank you so much, Chris. Oh,
Thank you.
there is a hand.
Thank you for having me. And this has been a true pleasure to work with Formative on this. And again, if you have any questions, please reach out either today or down the road.
And maybe actually Chris, we've got one question. Catherine, I'll go ahead and let you in. Thanks for being brave. You got a couple minutes.
Hey, Carl. Hey, Chris. What a great presentation. I got a lot out of it. Thank you so much. I was just wondering first of all, chat seems to be disabled on my side, at least, but from start to finish, it seemed like it was about a year. Is that seem accurate? Yeah. Okay.
It was actually a little bit less than a year. So we actually had to open up school and knew that we had some significant issues. So we really started the work engaging Formative, I think, in about November. So this was really from November until June and July that we really did a lot of that work in engagement of not only the public, but also the board. And then we had really the rest of July and the first 2 weeks of August to get everything in place and operational. So I would say if I'm putting numbers on it, I would say it was 7-8 months worth of work, definitely less than a year, but don't think that even though that we didn't have the roundtables and such from the beginning, that as we were rolling it out and it wasn't working the year prior, that we were trying to figure out how do we make this work.
Yeah.
I'll also say that some of the quick wins that are possible, where you can identify, here's a school where if we could get them to agree to accept students 5 or 10 minutes earlier, it's going to allow us to make a pairing to cover a route or make this afternoon the second tier route on time. Those kinds of things are things that you can do right away. And so, that can be part of an analysis that can happen very quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. And then Chris, who are your current providers, and are there multiple providers?
Yeah, for Yellow Bus, we currently have 3 providers. We have one that is probably got 2/3 of the route sets, and then 2 other providers that split the other third. So we find it that we like having 3. It keeps everyone honest and keeps the cost down because we have folks bidding against each other. On any given year, it'll ebb and flow, and one vendor may get a few extra routes and maybe the next year drop off. But that's seemed to work for us to have that continuum of service.
Sure, makes sense. Okay, that was really all I had. Carl, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Oh, Philip. And oh, sorry, Catherine, would you mind putting in the chat, if you can, which district you're representing, where you're coming from?
Yes.
Thanks. Hey, Philip.
Hi, this is Philip from the World Resources Institute. I think you mentioned you were shifting to an opt-in system, so I was just curious, I haven't heard that before. So if there were challenges there, like new kids needing to turn in paperwork or just what sort of equity considerations or other challenges you saw with that?
I'll let Chris speak to that. I mean, we did focus specifically on opt-out, as opposed to opt-in, which was finding parents that would voluntarily opt out, right? But another, so flipping the paradigm to an opt-in is very challenging and a different proposition, right? But we've gotten a lot of juice out of opt-out campaigns, identifying, tracking ridership, identifying non-riders, asking families to opt out, whether they're active riders or not, even going to sort of incentivize or induce, opt-outs by offering, this is not with Cincinnati, but in general, other strategies that can be used around opt-out, like offering transit pass or parent payment in lieu, for targeted families that are far flung to opt out. But again, yeah, like you're saying, opting in, forcing families to opt in, can be really challenging in terms of making sure everybody understands, can get access to the information. But Chris, you can comment in the CPS case.
Yeah, so really deep in the weeds on this one, and thanks for the question. So we had a multi-tiered approach to this. So we offered students to ride Metro, and that was one option, our public transit system. Option two was we did some pay in lieu of, where we knew that we had some pain points. We deemed some schools or some students to be impractical to transport based on where they lived and whether or not we had a bus going anywhere near that. We also did a couple of other things that were a little bit different, and this varies by district. But one thing that we did was we had a service suspension. So if a student didn't ride for 2 weeks, we had them have to opt back in. So if they didn't ride the bus for 2 weeks, they physically had to call us and opt back into their stop and pick up. As well as there were some other things that we've done. For example, our deviated stops. We used to redo all of our deviated stops every year. And so we carried them over from one year to the next, and then made parents, if they wanted to change it, they had to physically, go in and change that. But it was in place from the previous year. That saved us a lot of admin work at the beginning of the school year. So a myriad of options to kind of lessen the burden, if you will. There is no, one silver bullet. We tried a whole bunch of things, and I think the continuum of having 3 or 4 different options for individuals worked out in our case. But your market may vary.
Thanks so much, Philip, for that great question. Maybe one more, Charisma. I want to make sure you can get in. Thank you for asking the question. Go ahead.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, ma'am.
I'm working from home with my children, so I'm currently in a carpool line as we speak. But my name is Charisma, and I represent Parents in Motion. We are a startup here in Northeast Ohio that helps families connect to transportation resources for their families. We recently partnered with a startup called Go Together, which is a K-12 transportation platform that specializes in connecting families to bike pools, walking, public transportation, and carpools. But the reason for my question, I just wanted to know if you guys were looking to supplement any of these solutions, just so parents could have maybe a go-to option if all fails, or your solutions may not always fall through.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I'll say I love Go Together, and I think parent support, tech-enabled carpooling apps and support for parents in that regard is a great thing. And Chris, you can comment on how you all have thought about it in the CPS context.
We actually haven't engaged any of those solutions right now. But I would also say nothing's off the table. We just recently have a principal who's working on projects at our central office, and part of her work is safe routes to school and alternative ways to get to school. So we're looking at that as kind of a phase 2, phase 3 approach to the work that we did previously. But great question. Thank you.
No problem. So if you guys are interested in exploring further, I'll leave information to schedule a demo. And I would love to stay in contact just to see if you guys want to consider something in the near future.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Have a
Thanks
wonderful
very
day.
much. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. We are over time. Really grateful for those that were able to stay and for the great questions. And thank you, Chris. Everyone have an awesome day.